I knew I had to behave and perform and posture as a particular type of man in a particular way, as a means of not becoming a target, as a means of not being a fraggle, as a means of not being bullied. But that wasn't really how I was feeling inside, or that was me. I knew I had to kind of do that. So I think fear was a big part of my prison life, fear and vulnerability. But there was no way looking at me that you would identify that when I'm going down for my meals, or when I'm on the landing, or when I'm playing pool, or when I'm in the workshop. So I was able, I think there's some of the things, the vulnerabilities, they were some of the things I wanted to try and focus in on when we talk about men in prison. There were times when that door would shut, Naomi, and I would breathe a sigh of relief, and think, thank fuck I've got through another day. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a language for it. I knew that, you know, that this every day you'd wake up, you'd wake up, you'd hear the keys, you'd hear the flaps opening, and you'd have to psych up for that day to come, and get through that day. And you know, you'd open your door, you kind of shake off, and you'd walk out.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Okay, so today's guest is Dr. David Maguire, Honorary Senior Research Associate at UCL Institute of Education. David has researched and managed projects for excluded groups across sectors that include housing, education, prison, and the wider criminal justice system. In 2016, he was awarded a PhD from the University of Oxford for research focusing on the interplay between masculinity, education, unemployment, crime, and imprisonment. After holding lectureship positions in criminal justice, criminology and sociology, David took up a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellowship at UCL's Institute of Education that explored post-prison transitions into employment and education. He's written and published on prison masculinities and is the author of British Society of Criminology prize-winning book, Male, Failed and Jailed, Masculinities and Revolving-Door Imprisonment in the UK. He's also currently the director for the Prison Reform Trust's Building Futures project, which is a 5-year programme for prisoners who are serving or have served 10 or more years in prison. And we're really delighted to be able to welcome you along today, David. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Hi, David. It's very nice to meet you, and thanks a lot for coming along. So you are a very well-regarded criminologist, David, but you haven't always been observing prison life from this side of the bars. So what's led up to you being in this particular part of your life?
Yeah, a really good question. The conclusion in my book, I talk about, my book's very bleak, but in the conclusion, I talk about at the time when a lot of these experiences that led to me doing the research and being interested in the things I were interested. I could never imagined I'd be sat here and be described as a criminologist and not always being a criminologist. I suppose my experiences and what I'm interested in are shaped by inhabiting these same spaces of those that I research, of those that I've worked with. And I have this you'll have seen the conversations or no, I have this very ambivalent relationship to my experiences that shape my work and my thinking and my research, this insider positionality. So maybe just a bit of background. I grew up on an estate in Greater Manchester. It's an area where it was common for kind of criminal subcultures to, I'd be attracted to that. I was in trouble from an early age, in and out of police stations, solvents, in and out of, trouble all the time, excluded from school, eventually in and out of prison during the 90s. And I suppose it's all that kind of experience. You see, what's interesting is there's a movement now around drawing on lived experiences and positionality and convict criminology, and I find all that really, really interesting. But I haven't settled with it in so many ways, because I see my identity as being multi-layered. You know, from the home that I grew up with. You know, my dad was a drinker. He was abusive to my mom. He was kicked out when I was about 2, and then I had a stepdad who was from a different race, a different country, on an estate in Greater Manchester where there was a lot of racism. A large family, black and brown brothers, Irish. So I see all these multi-layers of identity as being important in how I see and view the world. And I see, as some of my work tries to map out, is how my identity as a man within these spaces contributed to pathways into prison, with prison being just one of them experiences. So I'm always reluctant to reduce my experiences down to just being an ex-prisoner, because I see education, family, street, all these spaces as being significant in what shaped me in my thoughts and my research interests. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but no, I haven't. You know, it was in prison though that I found education, not. And I talk about this a lot because it's something that I feel, I always get emotional when I talk about it too, because I wouldn't go to prison education. I always found it patronizing. I always found it, you know, that the language of it just wasn't, it just didn't suit me. But I met a prison teacher in Wayland, actually, because a lot of my offending was around drug use and substance kind of selling and that kind of thing. And as a swerve to try and get out of prison earlier, a parole swerve, I said I wanted to go and do a treatment program in Wayland in Norwich. And part of that was compulsory education. We had to go to education as part of the treatment. And I met this wonderful, I talk about her all the time, Maggie, who was a brilliant teacher who didn't force these awful kind of curriculums on us. She asked us what we was interested in, and she'd walk in every day with piles of stuff for individuals, her arms always full of books and magazines and different kinds of things to try and get us all interested. A wonderful woman who got me interested in education, and identified that well, she suggested in the classroom that I had a very particular learning difference. I might be dyslexic or one of these things, because my language didn't match with how I communicated via writing and other things. So she picked up, so that was a catalyst for me. And yeah, I took that out and run with it. I suppose I went to treatment post that sentence. That was my last sentence. And I went to drug treatment in London. And as part of that, we had to do activities to keep us busy. And I started an access course at Goldsmiths University. I got kicked out of school. I'd never read a full book till going to prison. So I had no kind of qualifications, no education to speak of. I'd never read. I was dyslexic. I used to have to get pub mates to write the envelopes of my letters because I couldn't handwrite. But anyway, I got in to do this access course at Goldsmiths, and it was a social science access course. And after the experience with Maggie, it was sitting in this classroom, talking back to kind of themes and issues and theories and thinkers that resonated with my experiences. And I felt I could contribute. Actually, if you speak to those that was facilitating the the kind of academics, they probably might say I spoke too much, but I really felt I could contribute to these debates and discussions, and my confidence were growing. And yeah, I just started to be able to resonate with some of the debates that was happening, and how they kind of reflected my experiences in my life, and I become interested. Yeah, and that's, you know, that journey continued. I suppose I did okay, and then I went on to do a degree at Westminster University. And it's interesting because one of the questions, not to preempt them, is about barriers. And this was in 99, 2000, and I wasn't really interrogated about my background. There was no real focus about where I come from. I was welcomed into the university without any real barriers to speak of in terms of access, I suppose.
And that was on the basis of the work you'd done at Goldsmiths, I expect.
So I suppose my access course was like what other people would have done, A-level type of things, and that opened the door to me to do a criminology and sociology degree at Westminster. And of course that went well. But linking it back to my work and my interest around this time, if you think about, this is 99, 2000, there was a lot of focus from early 90s on this idea of a crisis of masculinity, that boys and men are in crisis, that women have made far too much progress, and boys are suffering as a consequence in the school, in the workplace, and these kind of things interested me, and these discussions around men and masculinity, and you know, I was just encountering these academics, feminist scholars who were just introducing me to this work around men and violence and divisions of labor and sexuality and all these things that terrified me as a kid growing up, as someone in a prison, just, you know, but they felt liberating in many ways, some of these ideas, and it proper resonated with me, being able to reflect on my own experiences in the spaces that I've navigated, and how this literature talks back to that. So in some ways, this literature was quite a liberating experience, and I just kind of, you know, I was taken with it, and the academics that was writing about this stuff.
There's an awful lot you've been saying there, David. You know, one thing I was struck by was your mention of Maggie, and how meeting her in her position as a teacher kind of engaged with you. And it's surprising how often, well, perhaps it's not really surprising, how often that crops up in the discussions we have with people, the importance of a particular individual taking an interest and understanding. David Wilson, I think, the Birmingham criminologist chap, wrote a paper about this some years ago, which he described as the importance of having a champion. This was also about people in prison, somebody, and he was mainly referring to prison officers, who, you know, believed in you, and that making a huge difference in somebody's progress. But the other thing, sorry to go on a bit, because you said so much about forging an identity back there on that estate in Manchester, which was fascinating, because it sounded as if you had a whole mosaic of different influences out of which you had to forge a particular identity for yourself at that time, but which you've been working on shifting, you know, ever since. Does that sound familiar?
Forging an identity, we do forge these. I think, and that's what a lot of this stuff I was learning is when we were talking about a crisis of men and masculinity. Of course, these discussions around the 90s, they saw this as men as a whole, and I think what was striking to me in my thinking and my experiences, and it links back to these estates, it wasn't men as a whole. It was a particular group of men, a particular men from particular spaces, from particular places, who and this is where my work goes, through different shifts in divisions of labor, through different shifts in industrial relations, who were at the sharp end of some of these shifts. So yeah, for people who went before me to the schools before I went to, education wasn't, formal credentials wasn't a big factor. It was like you come out of that, and we all know about this, you come out relatively undereducated and you'd walk into a relatively decent shop floor job that you might keep for some years, that would pay enough for you to be able to kind of transition from home to your own place. All these spaces, as I was about reaching these, forging these notions of transitions from boyhood to manhood, was all reducing. These opportunities for men and boys was being taken away in these very particular spaces. And I suppose from my own experience, you know, I remember leaving school at 15, no qualifications, barely able to read and write, and I had a work ethic, because often we like to position generations of worklessness amongst particular groups of boys, but there was always a work ethic there. And I went from shop floor to shop floor, asking for jobs, and often in abusive shop floors where you know, people wouldn't think two ways of giving you a slap or being abusive to you. And them options was reducing. And of course, what a lot of this work that I've cited later on that I encountered is when options are reduced for men like us, we look at alternative ways of expressing a very particular identity. So if I'm growing up on the streets of these estates and I'm trying to perform an outward notion of masculinity, that could be done in different ways, whether it's being able to drive a car a particular way, whether it's be able to steal a motorbike in record time, whether it's being able to fight, whether it's being able to get the right kind of clothes. These are all outward facing indicators of masculinity that a lot of us try and navigate within these different spaces. So I think you're absolutely right. Identities was forged within these spaces, from looking up to my older brothers, from looking up on people on the estate who had reputations for earning money. You know, people had reputations for being a grafter, for being able to go out and make money. They were seen as kind of role models in some ways. For me, I don't want to speak to all the estate, and it's something I need to qualify very clearly. These are small sections of the estate. In these communities, often there are people, mostly parts of these communities work very hard, struggle, are very, very law-abiding, but small groups of us, subsections of us on these estates would look at ways of doing identity and navigating these very impoverished spaces in whatever resources we could access. So you're absolutely right. My identities was forged within them spaces under the economic conditions that I was in.
Sounds as if you were also talking about status within that as well, though, you know, in terms of how do you get status if there aren't more pro-social ways to manage to achieve that. You know, when your answer to the very first question I thought was really interesting. So I thought, how inspirational is that somebody who actually didn't really get into education and didn't enjoy it, and then here you are years later, that's how you make a living in education. So you've managed to fall in love with something that actually felt quite aversive maybe earlier on in life. So I thought that was interesting. But you know, it's like, how do you find status if the education is not grabbing you in a way that you can access? Because that seems to be the pathway for a lot of the status that we can get during adulthood, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So if you look at some of the literature around boys and schooling and education, very particular groups of boys will get status through being able to perform sports or work or school work, and then still mess about and be whatever. For us, performing schoolwork or sports was always a big one, but rejecting it was a way of getting a status. Anti-learning kind of cultures. This is going to do us no good where I'm going. So that was very much a part of generating status. Absolutely. It was very. I mean, status runs through everything you kind of do in them. Where you're highly visible to your peers, aren't you? When you I think I say it in my work, and it's in my own experiences. When you grew up on the estates, and the experiences that I have and some of the peers I grew up with and the men I research, the only groups we're with often are all male groups, peers, boys, and within them groups, they survey your behavior, they look for weaknesses, they look for clinks, that your identity as a man or a boy or respect is under so much scrutiny and surveillance often. And the minute you kind of crack, or that cracks, you can become vulnerable, you can become a target. So there's a lot of pressure often in them spaces. Once you've built an identity as well, is to sustain it and keep on maintaining it.
Thank you very much. And what you're saying just then about school and the meaning and the impact and the roles that people take up in school really took me back, because I go to a film group, and the other day they were watching a film called My Old School. And I couldn't go to it because I was up in Newcastle, but I wrote something for them to read out in my absence. And the first line of it was, I was lucky, I went to a very good school and made the worst of it. Because actually, I was a bit similar to you. I didn't really make the best of the opportunities that there were at school. And I think that's terribly common.
But can I maybe just add something to that? In that the opportunity, I didn't make the opportunities of a school. And I think what I do in my work, and again from my experiences, is our schools was awful. Our schools have been failing for years, underfunded, under-resourced. Teachers that would say, disillusioned, jaded teachers, that just didn't want to be there anymore. So when I was at school, it would be a failing school, and the men I research, I'd gone through all the Ofsted reports. These schools have been failing for years and years and years. And part of what my argument is it seems crazy to me that we can't invest in these spaces that are often taking some of the boys from some of the most deprived spaces, that are already deeply invested in these protest masculinities, going into already kind of underfunded, overcrowded school spaces. So you can imagine where all that starts. So I've been lucky in that I've sat with kids in Oxford who's come through 12 kind of in a class school. And had that level of tuition and all the rest of the stuff that we know is so important for transitions later on in life. So I think I'm glad you said that, because it gave me the opportunity to be able to say, when we look at some of the schools servicing some of the most deprived spaces, they're awful. And there's always that a few of them. I know you mentioned, I'd rather think, rather than Wilson, I'd rather think of what sociologists call as critical moments, where people encounter people like Maggie, or these brilliant teachers who go off and do above and beyond stuff. And these underfunded, heavily deprived school spaces are full of them brilliant people, but there's just not enough.
Yeah, sure. And of course, the iniquitous part of it is that the schools that I went to is still there, serving a very small proportion of the population to a very high standard, whilst I'm sure the schools that you mentioned in Manchester are still struggling and deprived. So anyway, moving on, thinking about your research here, David, because what's striking about it is that while many studies of men in prison focus in a fairly singular way on hypermasculinity, you focus on them as a more emotionally rounded individuals. So what led you to begin at that point?
I think already your questions have enabled me to be able to get in how both my experience and my work come together. My experiences, my identity, my navigating these spaces. And I think there's a lot of us as men, if we're really honest about ourselves, when we come out and reflect on really difficult spaces we've been in, if we're really honest about what some of them things are, how we feel inside and how we perform outside are two different things. And I was always struck by, prison for me. I knew I had to behave and perform and posture as a particular type of man in a particular way, as a means of not becoming a target, as a means of not being a fraggle, as a means of not being bullied. But that wasn't really how I was feeling inside, or that was me. I was putting signifiers out there, parts of identity that just didn't connect well with me inside, but I knew I had to kind of do that. So I think fear was a big part of my prison life, fear and vulnerability. But there was no way looking at me that you would identify that when I'm going down for my meals, or when I'm on the landing, or when I'm playing pool, or when I'm in the workshop. So I was able, I think there's some of the things, the vulnerabilities, they were some of the things I wanted to try and focus in on when we talk about men in prison.
David, can I just ask, were you conscious at the time of kind of like trying to mask that vulnerability, or is that something that you came to later on when you look back and think that's what I was doing?
There were times when that door was shut, Naomi, and I would breathe a sigh of relief and think, thank fuck I've got through another day. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a language for it. I knew that this every day you'd wake up, you'd wake up, you'd hear the keys, you'd hear the flaps opening, and you'd have to psych up for that day to come, and get through that day. And you'd open your door, you kind of shake off, and you'd walk out. It was literally. And people use a lot of Goffman and Ben Crew, and they talk about, and Yvonne, they talk about front stage and backstage performances within the prison space, and there was a lot of that for me. I'm sure 99% of the people in prison, I felt like this wasn't me. How I was externally showing it didn't feel like who I was. I'd hate to be called out on any kind of violence, but I had to posture a willingness for it. And I'd be terrified, and I'd find either deal with it or back away from it had I be called out on it. But I think an important part of that prison experience, and I talk about it, is although prison is a much more extreme, intense, highly severe, there's not a lot of spaces to get away from people, but a lot of us are pretty well, we've navigated all male spaces before, whether that's on the street, whether that's in schools, whether that's in care homes, and we know how important it is to put on a good front stage performance, and we know what the consequences are if we don't. And of course, this is all at the extreme end. It becomes part and parcel of your daily life. You meet peer groups, you're a lot more relaxed, but you're always aware that there's a clumsy word. You say something clumsy to somebody, or a spark that could just cause serious violence. And that's always, that is something that, whether that's in a pub, or whether it's in a prison, or whether in some of these all male groups, you're always conscious that that there's a potential for violence to happen.
Thank you. And beyond the kind of like the hypermasculine and the vulnerability, what were the other aspects of identity that emerged from your research that were relevant to men?
So I think some of the things, you know, I think we do, you know, and it's coming across in this conversation. I think we have to acknowledge that some more prisons and some more male spaces can be very, very brutal environments, and there's all kinds of explanations and reasons for that hypermasculinity. But I think what I've tried to do with some of the work that I do and some of the conversations and research is to try and understand, use gender a bit more to understand men and boys, and why how we perform and do some of the things we do, and to try and use gender more as a means of understanding the gendered vulnerabilities of men and boys. Because I think what we have been brilliant at, and what I think I'd really like, you know, scholars of masculinity in prison to do more of, is learn from the brilliant work of people who's used gender as a way to talk about women and marginalization and vulnerabilities. Because men do gender too. And often when we think of gender, we often associate it with women and women's imprisonment and women's kind of, and I wonder how we can shift them conversations to use gender more to talk about some of the troubles that men have. And these are things that I've talked about in my book around these ideas of, you know, identity, tradition, you know, holding on to a traditional male identity that's no longer there. These ideas of you know, missing important life events as men. These roles that are expected of us from coming from working class communities of protectors and providers, that prison often deprives us of, and that we feel a lot of shame around. And these are the things that I wanted to try and pull out in my book a bit more, is how men deal with being absent men and what their imagined futures might be as men, and the pressures that they put on themselves to try and live up to particular ideals as men. So, you know, I'm sure I can go in a prison tomorrow and talk to similar kind of men, and they will often think that their imagined futures will be a good breadwinning job to sustain them and a family and kids, to be able to provide for their loved ones, and domesticity, this idea of a good partner, a good job, a good house, will make all their lives and futures seem exactly perfect, and they can attain that. And of course, many of us have never been able to attain that, because labour markets has changed. Our deference for particular types of workplaces and adjusting to them is more of a challenge. People often don't, you know, want to work for very kind of ridiculously exploitative wages and have some of the kind of deference that we need for that. So these are the kind of gendered pressures that I wanted to try and get us to talk about when we're thinking more about men in prison, because often, and it's there and it happens, we think a lot about the brutality of men in prison, but we don't think enough about the vulnerabilities as fathers, as sons, as brothers, as other men, you know, among other men, and that's some of the conversations that I was hoping I could generate.
I really hear that sense of kind of failure permeating that, which obviously is significant, given you singled it out within the title of your book as well. I wondered whether there were other aspects of that experience that might be less bleak, whether there were any signs of hopefulness within those accounts.
I mean, I suppose that's how I concluded my book, is we don't know. In my own experience, I was able to generate different forms of capital to express a very particular type of identity. I was given, you know, I found different pathways, and I generated different types of masculine capital, if you like. And when I've had done this interview, I've had been a participant, someone else coming in doing the research I was doing, and I've been a participant in that research, I would never for a second have seen any kind of future outside of where I was at that very particular time. So of course, there's individuals, and there's moments, and there's opportunities, and there's critical moments that these sociologists talk about. I think what I'd like to talk more about when we speak about men in prison, and I see it more in my day job, is the compassion and care that men can show each other in prison. And although, you know, prisons can, as I say, be difficult spaces, but there's so much informal care, support and compassion that goes on the prison landings that we need to talk much more about among men who see somebody new on the landing, of course, who kind of share stuff for people who've just come in, who kind of give clothes or get people to send them something in. There's all kinds of, you meet someone in the dinner queue and something's happened, listen, come and see me later, we'll have a chat. There's all kinds of that informal support that goes on amongst men in prison that we don't encourage, or maybe some spaces do, that we need to talk much more about, that we need to kind of find the spaces within prison to encourage much more kind of support amongst other men. And I think what brought that home to me, and it's outside of my research, it was part of my day job. I was visiting a very difficult Cat B prison during lockdown, and I was talking to some of the lads on the wing, and because they were coming out individually for meals and things like that, he said, Dave, I'm in a really bad way. He said this idea of being locked up, I miss, you know, if I was having an hard time, I might see someone going down for my washing or my laundry, and just a throwaway comment in that encounter can lead to some kind of support from somebody else. When we withdrew, even them simple acts within a prison space of nipping to the laundry, of nipping to get your canteen, of the different things, it hit home to me. I've just them momentary encounters often, if you've had a bad call or you've had a letter and you just walk past someone on a landing and say, I'm really struggling. And once you've got them type of relationships, you can say about relationships and things are difficult. And sometimes there's a lot of support that can come with that amongst men. And we don't talk about that half enough, how men get other men through really difficult jail time.
I think that's such an important point. It really resonates. And I think, you know, when Joe Public thinks about prison, I think what they think of is a frightening environment. And there's obviously the boredom that's associated with prison, but certainly kind of like seeing that level of, I suppose, love and compassion from men towards each other. And I've spoken before on the podcast about, you know, running groups where people were very much loners at the start of treatment. And then in year 3, we're talking about feeling loved and cared for. And some of that was about their relationship with staff members, but an awful lot of it was about how they related to one another and how they felt genuinely supported and cared for. And having heard and seen prisoners advocating for other men in prison, to, you know, for somebody to be a bit kinder, give them a bit of leeway because they were having a bad day, or lending them something and not expecting double bubble back in relation to it. You know, you see those elements of kindness and compassion. And actually, I think it would be nice if there was some research done on that, because it would be good to understand that more, to understand how that can be helped to flourish and how to make the best, rather than, you know, I think we spend an awful lot of time talking about, and obviously prison is awful, but we spend all our time really digging into that without thinking about, I think with everything, you need a bit of balance, don't you? And you need not just the focus on the tragedy of it, but how can you also focus on ways that you might find some redeeming features, some compassion, some connection, something that might offer an alternative where, you know, a man gets a different message to the message he might have had previously.
Yeah, completely agree. Completely.
But But in terms of kind of like thinking about your research and these aspects of masculinity that you're talking about represented in prison, how do you see any similarities with other spaces that are predominantly male, like amongst the homeless or people with addictions? I mean, they're both populations where they're predominantly male clients, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think Anton Roberts in Sheffield is doing some interesting research around masculinity and homelessness, and of course from a less kind of research, I've got personal experience of kind of addictions, and I'm working in the sector, but I suppose they all kind of come together in many ways, don't they? That we can't separate. So from my own experience, I've encountered the streets and addiction and prison, and some of them all link up quite nicely, don't they? And I think understanding the pathways around that is an important one. Around one of the things that's not my area of expertise, and it's certainly your area more than mine, and it was one of an observation of my work, is I don't talk around trauma enough, around thinking about some of the pathways of men. That's not what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to focus on the gendered kind of navigating particular spaces. But of course, a lot, and this links to some of my main argument, is thinking about the gendered vulnerabilities of men and boys, and where we get some of that kind of the violence that perhaps we've encountered at early ages, how that kind of shapes us in response to other men, in response to relationships, in response to authority. And I think Simon Winlow and Anthony Ellis do some fantastic work around violence and trauma and masculinity, how overbearing violent fathers or other men in our lives, because often, it's other men who are violent to other men. And certainly in my own experiences, in very early experiences, some of the biggest violence perpetrated to me was by men who should have been in a position to care rather than be perpetrators. But it's how we carry that, and how we kind of are unable, masculine ideals of us to clothe that, to bury that, to kind of perform that, to hide that through performances of violence to other people. And then of course there's the kind of hedonistic type of stuff, is wanting to kind of not knowing when to stop, is that idea of drinking more than everybody else, using more than everybody else within a very particular environment. And of course all these, and then you match that with resistance to authority in education and all the rest of it. You can easily see how that leads to a pathway to substance misuse, to homelessness, to not being able to develop relationships. So it does all, we can use masculinity to understand some of these experiences.
Yeah, you can really see how that all weaves together. But I also wondered whether there are any implications of your work and reflections for less marginalised male groups, such as the military and construction workers, both groups where you see more men than women.
Yeah, I mean, brilliant questions. I suppose one thing that I learned, and I've learned in my research, is we can be in these positions, can't we? We can be your scaffolders or your military, and we can be performing and feeling like we're doing okay. We've got these, we've got a partner at home, we've got a good job, and often, that can all go in an instant, really. That that might be somewhere around maintaining, responding to other men, maintaining status, or whatever it is. I mean, the fragility of masculinity is what's interesting to me, because when I think about my prison research, there are men that I researched there that would wake up one day, very high status men on the landing, and the next day they're on a VP landing for something that they've not been able to sustain or been able to live up to. In the same way, there are those men who get up and who in these other employment, military, we see a lot of ex-military who can't leave that kind of identity and have that status and confrontation with other men. I think our prisons are 95% male, aren't they? And often they are mostly filled with men from the kind of environments that I talk about. But there are also men there who's got into a fight one weekend, who's done some very serious violence towards a partner. They are your scaffolders. There are your ones who your accountants or whatever. And I think, there are lots of brilliant explanations around masculinity and power that really can talk back to some of that stuff.
One of the things I was really struck by is the really high incidence of suicide, isn't there, amongst construction workers? And I think it's one of the highest, in terms of professional groups. And you have to wonder, to what degree that's reliance on doing masculinity in a certain way and not acknowledging vulnerability might be contributing and I think there's often been a lot of resistance to women penetrating male groups, for instance, when women first started working in prisons, and the idea that women would be a vulnerability for a service, would be a liability, rather than vulnerability. But actually, I think quite often women, by virtue of doing things slightly differently, might chip away at some of the stereotyped way of having to be masculine, and might give a bit more permission to the softer side of, the more vulnerable part of men.
Yeah, I think so. And I think people are beginning to, there are different, Andy's men's group, there are different groups where men are being encouraged to talk to other men more, to support other men more, to call other men out on particular things. And I remember we, during COVID, set up a men's group. And I think that, and there are other things that's happening that I'm much more cynical around, is your more kind of mythic poet, you're kind of embracing a traditional masculinity that's been lost. I don't really think very much of them kind of groups, but I think what was great for me in my own experience is being able to, and look, it's progress, not perfection. I was lucky. I encountered brilliant feminist scholars who was doing brilliant work on men and violence, and who actually got to suit. All my journey has been through these amazing feminist researchers, from Lynn Siegel at Birkbeck to Linda McDowell at Oxford, to the people these brilliant people who said we want to try and understand more, or showed me these different ways of understanding how fragile these identities were. How it's not, how we're not biologically driven to want to hurt other people. It's about how this is constructed in ways as means of what we feel is survival or navigating or coping or whatever. And so, I've been really lucky in that I've had these learning from, and actually being on the sharp end of violence of other men as well, and being able to recognize that, the most people that's caused me violence are other men from being a kid, right growing up. And I don't know what I'm saying there. I'm kind of losing my thought without over disclosure, but yeah, I do think we need to find ways of encouraging men, and it sounds really cliche, it sounds really corny, but men to talk more to women, to other men, to colleagues, to know how to reach for help. I suppose another thing that may have been helpful to me is I've done a lot of, because of my substance misuse, I've been around kind of therapy talking groups. And that's enabled me to find a language of vulnerability more, to be more honest and take a chance. I think that fear of revealing something to other people, and I've done it. I think I've given too much. People are going to think this, I'm going to think that, and I've carried that kind of fear of over disclosure or whatever to other groups. And my biggest fears have never come true of people throwing my vulnerabilities back or whatever. So I don't know what I've kind of said there. You've got a lot of editing to do, but I've learned a little bit to be able to talk and reach out to people, whether that's my partner, whether that's other men in the fellowships of the the addiction things I do. So I don't know.
No, it's great, thank you. And moving things along a little bit, if we don't just focus on masculinity, do you see other aspects of identity such as race and class impacting on masculinity? Does too much get landed within masculinity that might also be about different dimensions?
So I certainly hope that class is completely explicit, is completely there in all the work that I do. I'm from these conversations early on about school. Class is a major is major to all these ideals of, if a lot of us are the resources or whatever, the leisure resources, the education resources, the kind of, the after school clubs, the kind of car clubs, the different kind of, you'd see a much reduced prison population. Or you might see, I think class is there at every step of the way. Is how we navigate impoverished spaces is key to the work I do as men. So it intersects with class and space and place. That comes out of my work. In terms of race, of course, there's people who are much better equipped and research in this area to talk about some of this stuff. But what's always been interesting to me is I grew up in a family of there was 10 of us, and I was the only white male in that family. And when I used to hear about particular privileges or whatever, I used to look around and struggle to understand what was meant by any kind of privilege that might have come from the spaces where I grew up. It was hard to associate and understand what was being discussed there. And a little bit more thought and reflecting just from my own experience without being able to go into all the literature there is I've been with my three brothers, my brothers walking into particular spaces and seeing things, them being treated differently or much more under surveillance or much more talked down to, or whether it's starting school as one of the younger ones and saying, yeah, we know who your brothers are, I'm sure you won't be like them. And all this had racist connotations under all of the different, whether it was the police coming to the house, the way they was policed, the way I was policed differently. So of course it's there. I've had that kind of outsider but insider gaze onto how all that plays out. My expertise isn't to be able to talk about it in any detail about research but we all know the disproportionalities. We all know how there was much more visible. There was over policed. There was, the people on the estate tried to treat them differently, and a lot of their getting in trouble was actually kind of responding to the way people treated them so they got reputations for being violent, they got reputations for whatever. But class, and of course, it underpins everything we do, as it interplays with masculinity and place.
So, thanks for that, David. I was wondering if I could take you back a little bit to when you were talking about care and levels of caring on the wings, because I would imagine that perhaps a bit like the estate in Manchester you were talking about earlier on, that it was a bit patchy because there'd have been areas on the landings where somebody was a particularly dominating bully and so on. So there'd be all kinds of groups and factions on the wing. And I sometimes think that the prison service takes that as a kind of baseline, really, and chooses, or is unable to see the levels of caring to the extent that you're describing anyway, and operates its procedures accordingly. And I wonder if that applies to society also. Do you think society is interested in seeing the fully rounded man that you're referring to?
I read this question. Let me just find.
Well, the question is fairly coherent, but my waffle before it may not be.
I'm not sure. No, I think it's a good question, and it's got me to think about what is a fully rounded man, in terms of how do we know, in terms of, because it's fluid, it's forever shifting, it's not fixed. What does society want from their men, I suppose, is an interesting question. What do we as men want from our men? What do our mothers want? What do our partners want? What does society need from us as men? I mean, I like to think I might come across as fully rounded, but it's so fragile. I think, and I often I've used it in this interview. Progress, not perfection. I think our conditioning, our navigating particular spaces, it never goes. Okay, it never. I'm always anxious of being bullied by another man, of being threatened by somebody, and whether that's in the car or whether that's in a supermarket, and whether that takes me back to the family home or whatever it does, I'm always worried about being hurried or being kind of intimidated, or having to give off signals that I'm not to be, and there's always this kind of, I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to say. When I think of a fully rounded man, I think most of the time, I can be that person that's caring to other people, that's tolerant, that's kind of the partner, the kind of hard worker, the kind of doing okay, emotionally kind of strong. I'm not sure but that's unsustainable for most of us, right? And
it's really interesting to hear you talk about that, though. That kind of relentless pressure in a way to. Oh, well, I was curious about David discussing the fact that actually having to be mindful a lot of the time about what interactions you have with men and other men. And that being something that's there at the back of your mind a lot of the time. So I thought it was quite interesting to hear that as a woman.
Certainly, true for me. One's constantly adjusting one's response to, well, right from the very first second that you encounter somebody, you're making a judgment about how I'm going to present myself and represent myself to them, and of course within a group that becomes even more complex.
I do think it is something that, and of course it links to the spaces we've navigated, and it is something, I think that's part of how we've been kind of learnt to survive or cope. I don't want to get into language I don't understand, but I know often that I will do things, whether it's in a supermarket queue or whether there's somebody walking behind me. If I think I'm possibly holding somebody up, I might try and step aside and let them pass me, because I worry. A lot of time is often spent about avoiding what could be a potential confrontation, or what I might read as a confrontation. So somebody rough pushing past me and sighing would be a bit of a something to kind of navigate, to cope with. Whether it might be a group of chaps in a particular space where you have to walk past in a very particular way, or you feel you have to walk past in a very particular way, whether that's the right amount of eye contact, or whether that's the right amount of kind of uprightness or whatever. It's easy to sit here and kind of say these, a lot of it is inbuilt. It's you kind of do it, and I think it is as a result of the different highly kind of tense spaces that you may have navigated, from the school to the street to the prison to the workplace to wherever, amongst it sounds exhausting. It is exhausting. It's exhausting for my wife in the car sometimes when I'm feeling somebody's too close to me. There's all kinds of mechanisms, I think, that a lot of us kind of navigate on a daily basis. Now I've got worried that I'm sounding quite unpredictable by explaining, but I we don't, of course, act on them things. They're in a dialogues that go on.
Yeah, no, far from it, David. It's really refreshing to hear somebody talking in a very honest, open way about vulnerability, which I think normally vulnerability in relation to men is often located in women's vulnerability to men. So it's good to hear about how that also ripples through men as well.
Yeah. So moving on, and I think you've touched upon this all already. I was wondering if you think, I got slightly stuck ruminating on the statements from the Justice Secretary over the past months, really, because coming from the Justice Department seems a determination to see all imprisoned men in one particular way, which is as monsters. And do you think that's feeding to a need of society as a whole? What part can we play in changing that, do you think?
Well, I'm not going to go down that route because you'll cut me out. But I think there are particular psychologists that help, or criminologists, psychologists. I don't quite know where they sit, but that kind of help to feed that kind of public appetite of everybody being this predatory, manipulative, what was the word you described, David? Monster. And I think some of us need to be much more responsible about the languages we use, the work and the privilege of access that we've had in these spaces, and how we exploit that access and that friendship that people have shown us within these spaces to then go out and help to flame these narratives of monsters and dangerousness and people can never be fixed or right. So there's something I think we can do and challenge. I think within our discipline, I'm not sure whether I fully identify as a criminologist, but I think within our discipline, whether it's, we need to challenge people when some of them narratives are seeping out from our colleagues, in the same way we ask people to challenge inappropriate behavior from men to women or whatever. I think as professionals and colleagues, we need to try and at least have conversations around Because justice I mean, I'm straying too dangerously in my PRT, getting in trouble, but we know that, you know, my worry is there's not a lot to cling any hope onto at the minute, whether that's Dominic Raab or whether whoever gets in. Imagine what is echoing through the long-term indeterminate prison estate population on some of this awful stuff that's coming out, and how you get up and maintain hope when you can do everything that's asked of you, and suddenly that can be taken away by an arbitrary, ill-informed decision. And a lot of them decisions are feeding into a public appetite of people being, you know, the prison not working properly, us letting lots of really monsters out back onto the streets, whereas we know that's not, those of us that work in and around these spaces know that's not the case. And I think we need to work harder to counter some of them narratives. I'm seeing brilliant Twitter accounts. Whoever does that anonymous parole account is doing a fantastic job of trying to counter some of the ill-informed narratives that are coming out. I think what strikes me as well, and you're probably going to have to cut this because I'll get in trouble, but what strikes me is how ill-informed the public are on how prison sentences work, on how prison works. You know, they don't understand. People think you do half your sentence and you come home. They don't understand that, you know, people are on average around 9 years over tariff. People don't get out that easily. But I'm glad you give me the opportunity to say that. I don't know how much, you know, that is me speaking as my
which is, you know, imagine you've heard some pretty painful stories during the course of your research. How do you look after your own well-being and keep yourself nourished and positive in your outlook?
Well, that's a really good question, but I was looking forward to your number 11 question, which is can I just talk back to that, because I think it's a really thoughtful question. What about boys?
Yes. So I was going to ask you about, but I skipped. Was what about boys, and whether we hold boys to different standards than girls, for instance, when we talk about gangs and county lines.
And you know, I built this up as if I've done a lot of thinking around. I haven't, but I just think that I think it's a really good question. And it links us to gender in a really nice way, because we need to think about boys much more around coercion, around grooming, around how this works. There's a lot of great people doing this stuff already, but I think we certainly need a much more language. And this is the result of brilliant scholarship and advocacy around women and girls that have been able to pull out some of that grooming, some of that exploitation stuff, some of that language around coercion. How can we learn from that and be much better at using it around your 12-year-old who's being groomed by the elders on the estate to kind of hold things, to do running for people, to kind of just get into that lifestyle that becomes near impossible to come out of. So yeah, I think that's a really important question, and hopefully we're progressing a little bit more to understand boys as being vulnerable to that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly when you work with men who've been involved in gang crime, you hear very much the same stories that you get from girls who've found themselves groomed into sex. You know, that it might not always be sex that's been exchanged with boys, but certainly there's the same kind of stories. But yes. So hopefully we're not going to swerve how you look after yourself.
Yeah. No, how do I look after myself? Well, I'm very I mean, look, I'm around good people. I've been in around recovery circles for coming up 20 years in June. I'm around people who I'm not going to fib. I need to be much better at asking for help and reaching out and talking to people. But I've got a really supportive, brilliant wife who I can talk to. You know, I've got colleagues I need to look after myself a bit better. It's a really good question. I've never been quite, I remember when we was in treatment, and on a Friday, they'd always have this question: what is the nice thing you're going to do for yourself at weekend? And it's really struck me how so many of us struggled to go out and look after ourselves and do something good for ourselves. It's again, progress, not perfection. It's something, you know, I do have good people around me, but I need to draw on them much more than I currently do.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, David.
Thank you. It's really considered brilliant questions. Thanks for the opportunity.